Hello and welcome to my audience of humans, birds, and lizards. For this week, rather than my considerations on writing and the lessons on it I have learned, I will delve into one of the other creative hobbies of mine. Tabletop RPGs. For this week and the following week, the topic will be writing adjacent. I will be discussing my thoughts on world building and its role in planning a tabletop campaign. Some of this may contain my thoughts on world building as it relates to writing fiction, but most of it will be geared more towards RPG campaigns. So without further ado, welcome to the first episode of Tabletop Thoughts. Everyone who becomes a GM will want to make their own campaign world at one point or another. It might be because they have an idea or theme they want to explore, or they are unhappy with the existing setting of their favorite game, or they might just not have any idea that pre-made settings exist and think every campaign world is made from scratch. It does not matter, in the end, because we all make one. In my experience, one of the most important broad functions of world building is to provide context. Your world informs a number of important details that you and your players will interact with, and provides the necessary framework for the players to design their characters. No character or adventure exists in a vacuum, so even if all you have is the idea of a long-forgotten tomb full of ancient magical relics in the middle of a hostile jungle, you still have some context. It might not necessarily be a lot of context, and probably not enough for newer players who may not be familiar with the expectations of dungeon crawling, but there is still some context. Though in general, providing so little information about the world is probably best avoided unless you are very good at making things up and keeping it all coherent on the fly. It is a challenge, especially if you have a group that leans towards the chaotic. Over the years, through numerous successful and unsuccessful campaigns, I have observed that world-building context can be used to fill four distinct functions. Whether or not it fulfills these functions with any subtlety will depend on the GM and how they use it. To better illustrate these different functions, I will use two examples. One of them is an apocalyptic fantasy world where humans band together to fight against the elemental hordes. The other is a society of sorcerers that hide in plain sight in the modern world. The first function, and arguably the most important, is that it nudges players in particular directions. You will never be able to effectively steer a player exactly where you want them to be without brute force, but the right context can cut off certain options from them without you needing to explicitly say so. This preserves player agency while still letting you create a box for the player characters to operate in. For the Sorcerer Society setting, the modern world automatically rules out more fantastic options such as cyborgs or orcs. The characters all come from and live in the modern world, even if they have a double life that plays out in a hidden magical one. I can further create limitations by simply mentioning where the game takes place. Players will likely think of different characters in a game set in New Orleans versus one set in Beijing. If the assumption is that the party consists of sorcerers who are aware of the hidden world and are involved in its disputes and politics, that also changes what characters might be created. In the case of the apocalyptic fantasy setting, the context easily suggests that magical artifacts are probably rare. The comforts of advanced civilization will probably be limited or available in limited supply in the most secure of locations. The players might also not want to have their characters depend on elemental magic because the hordes that are attacking what remains of civilization are based on those same elements. Spellcasters that rely on learning and scholarly study might have a difficult time, but those that draw on outside sources of power are at a possible advantage. Fantasy folk like elves and orcs might be extinct or just very rare, further giving players something to consider. Another important function of world-building context is it sets the conflicts in place for that world. Conflict is central to tabletop campaigns, because at bare minimum, the party has to have something to oppose them as they go about their plans. In some cases, an external conflict might be the only way to keep the player characters on the same page and not actively attempting to murder each other. When I build a world, I try to install conflicts at various levels of scale. Some will be big, some will be small, but all of them will be something the characters can interact with. In the apocalyptic fantasy setting, the obvious conflict is between the hordes of elementals ravaging the world and what's left of civilization. However, there are also tensions between the various groups within the few protected locations. There is conflict between those who use magic and those who blame magic for the current circumstances. The militia that is fighting to protect what remains might be in a political conflict with the civilians that run the government or the guilds that control what little manufacturing capability that remains. There might also be collaborators and traitors in the midst of the survivors. Underneath all this are hundreds of smaller conflicts that just emerge from the ongoing struggle to survive. For Sorcerer Society, the conflicts are less violent and more about subterfuge and politics. There is a divide among the sorcerers about whether or not to remain hidden from the rest of the world. There are factions that rail against the restrictions and laws of their society. The different forms of magic, the colleges will call them, may have an old rivalry going on over who has the best approach and method. A rivalry that can turn very sour at times, perhaps. Related to this is the third function of world building as context, which is setting the stakes of any given conflict. Players are unlikely to care about any given conflict if they don't understand what's at stake. They might participate and involve themselves in it, but they aren't going to be as engaged if you don't give a clear idea of what they stand to lose if they fail or what they might gain if they succeed. In the same way that your world can help players define their characters, it also helps you define what the stakes are. For Sorcerer Society, the possible stakes of any given situation can vary. The easiest one to tap would be the balance between the mundane lives and the hidden magical lives the characters lead being put in jeopardy. Another possible large-scale thing to put at stake is the maintenance of the secrecy of the magical world. I personally prefer the first option because it has more emotional weight on characters, though the second option can easily lead to the first. For other personal stakes, you might consider making the conflict jeopardize a character's social standing in magical society or some goal that only matters to them, rather than anyone else. In an apocalypse scenario, the obvious thing at stake is the survival of the world. However, I find this too impersonal and a little hard to grasp, and thus hard to feel personally involved in. I try to weave in smaller and more intimate stakes. Can the characters keep their sanity and stability in a world that is increasingly more dangerous? Are they prepared to deal with the loss of friends and family as they keep fighting a losing battle? You can even set the stakes in truly small and immediate forms, like whether or not they'll succeed in their current supply run or trying to convince others to assist in a suicidal effort to rescue a comrade. The final function of world building as context is filling in the details that can make a world feel real and lived in. While this element is not always player-facing, it is often useful to have some idea of these day-to-day details in case it becomes relevant. This can range from local customs of the lands where their character is from to what kind of rituals are typical in a country, whether religious or social. These are not necessary details at character creation and it is entirely possible for the campaign to never deal with them, but these little things can end up being incredibly immersive. In the case of the apocalyptic fantasy setting, characters might find that the upper classes and material elites still observe old rituals and traditions and anyone who is looking to gain their favor must adhere to them as well. Perhaps the elementals are sentient enough that they have religious rites and practices that dictate their choice of targets when on the attack. What the survivors believe about the elemental hordes can be important, especially if no one is sure if any of them are true. For the Sorcerer Society setting, this function can allow you to go deeper into the nuances since you don't have to work for the surface-level elements of the culture. It is also important because you can use it to highlight where the hidden society differs from the modern world in terms of things like what they consider valuable, what their relation to mundane authorities are, and the unspoken rules of conduct and etiquette. You would be surprised how much drama mileage you can get out of the littlest things. And is the end of this week's incoherent ramblings on world building as it relates to tabletop campaigns. Next week, unless something changes, I will do a bit more rambling in relation to tabletop campaigns and world building. Until then, thank you for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing or commenting on how wrong I am about my thoughts.